I particularly love this because you can just translate it literally and it's still funny today. However, it is funny for different reasons. We're inclined to read this as with something of a homophobic tinge. The first 3 lines, all right, what you're doing is normal, it's all right because you're preparing to have sex with a woman. When that becomes impossible, and it becomes apparent that he's preparing to have sex with a man, then we can laugh at him. Then we can ridicule him. He becomes culpable in some sense. But, as I stated, the definition of sexuality, of sexual expression, does not depend on the gender of the person you're having sex with, but what you do with them. So what's really going on is that for the first 3 lines, it is reasonable to assume that he is getting ready to have sex in the active posture. He's with his girlfriend. She's physically incapable of taking the active role, that is, of penetrating him, and that was normal. But when we get to the point that that's no longer possible because he's working on a part of his body that his girlfriend has no legitimate sexual interest in, now he's preparing to be the passive partner in a sexual act, and that is culpable. That we can ridicule him for. And why is that? Well, it's because of our friend the phallus. I also really just wanted to put this picture on a slide, but what this image does sort of demonstrate is the peculiar cultural resonance that erect penises had in ancient Rome. It's a strange cultural obsession, really. We have stories of religious festivals in which people would carry 50-foot-long replicas of phalluses down the street while people sang and danced around them. And the erect penis represents virility, it represents strength, potency. It's an expression of your masculinity. And wielding it is sort of the ultimate expression of your masculine identity. Becoming subject to it, that is, being the receptive partner in an active penetrative intercourse, is surrendering your masculinity in a semiotic sense to a stronger, more powerful, more virile man. And that is something that especially elite Romans were extremely uncomfortable with. This is socially degrading, and indeed personally dangerous. In Roman courts, you frequently, if you were arguing a case in front of a Roman court, and you were up there speaking, one of the stock themes that you would invoke is to imply that either your opponent or one of the witnesses or the defendant had been having the wrong kind of sex with men. That made him untrustworthy in the eyes of the jury. It degraded and demeaned him, made him less of a man. And so you see a whole heck of a lot of that going on. So we understand sex as a function of penetration. That's the role that you occupy, or the role that you perform, in effect becomes a part of your social identity, a part of your nature, in the same way that we understand gay and straight as being parts of our nature. But within a paradigm that depends on penetration to explain sexual roles, obviously you start to get into trouble in cases where sex that has no penetration, particularly sex that has no phallus. So I'm going to show you something that I absolutely love. I believe that this is, in fact, the dumbest thing that a man has ever said about sex in history. And you can see if you agree with me when we get through this. And I will point out that there are 2 lines of the translation that are square bracketed. So all the other translations are my own. I used a 1919 Edwardian British translation of those 2 lines just so that I could translate them myself and reserve the effect. So in 190, Marshall is describing and making fun of a woman who has sex with other women. And so he describes her always hanging out with women, there are no rumors that she ever took a male lover. And then we have this, I thought you were like Lucretia, is a very virtuous, noble, chaste figure from Roman mythology. And then it says, oh no, you were actually fucking like a man. And then we have the chaste Edwardian translation, you dare things unspeakable, and your portentous lust imitates man. That actually bears no resemblance to what the Latin says. what the Latin actually says, so the word at the end of the line there, kunos, is a vulgar euphemism for female anatomy. The nearest we can come for an English translation is to say cunt, so that's what I'm going to say. The line says, you try to rub two cunts against each other, and then the next line says, and your ginormous clitoris acts like a dick. So, in trying to explain two women having sex with each other within this penetrative context, which is the only way that they can explain people having sex with each other, he envisions two women sort of front to front, bumping against each other, and one of them has such enormously enlarged genitals that she manages to penetrate the other woman. And that's how two women have sex when there's no man there. I think it's a good candidate for dumbest thing possibly a man has ever said. But what we see illustrated in this, the extraordinary lengths that you have to go to in order to preserve this paradigm. We explain sex in terms of the phallus. And so you have to engage in these astonishing logical gymnastics in order to preserve the paradigm in which they're operating. And it all illustrates to me sort of what unsteady ground Roman masculinities were actually built on and how tenuous the concept is, because there are so many ways in which you could just nudge it and it would entirely collapse. But an endless preoccupation of men was defending their masculinity, not appearing feminine, not appearing passive, which is, it seems to me like an awful lot of work. It's exhausting. And for one more little absurdity, I want to talk about this poem, which this poem bothered me immensely the first couple of times I read it, because it didn't make sense to me. Structurally speaking, there has to be a joke there in the last line, and I could never understand what the joke was. So he's addressing a man who obviously has a young male lover. He's describing they've kissed, they've had sex. You lie with a naked Ganymede, a reference to Zeus's lover, Zeus's cupbearer from Greek mythology. And then, so he goes on to say, all right, that's okay what you've done so far, but don't masturbate him afterwards. And it says untranslatable there, and the untranslatable word was the problem that I was encountering and trying to figure out why this is funny. Because the word that's untranslatable is up there, it says fututriki. And it's an adjective, it's modifying the word hand, and it's an agent noun of a verb futur that means to fuck. So Latin forms agent nouns in exactly the same way that English does. The verb is to act, and an actor is somebody who acts. A writer writes, a speaker speaks, etc. And the word manu is feminine, so its adjective has to be feminine as well. So fututriki is the feminine agent noun of this verb to fuck. And a little grammar lesson which is necessary to explain this joke. As well, it has to be feminine, grammatically speaking, but agent nouns can take a masculine or feminine gender. The masculine is often used in Roman humor. You would use a masculine where there should be a feminine in order to crack a joke about a woman acting in an excessively masculine manner, or use a feminine where you should have a masculine in order to imply that a male subject has been behaving in a feminine manner. So the fututriki manu, I mean, you can't say that a hand has been engaged in the action of fucking, at least not in this context. But describing it as the feminine agent of the action of fucking, he's envisioning the hand clasped around the penis as being penetrated. And by extension, this is feminizing the man. It's degrading him. It's socially demeaning. And that's why he becomes ridiculous at that point. Everything he's done up to that point is okay, but this, your masculinity is being impaired. You're getting feminine, and that's not okay. So I'm sort of closing with that because I think it illustrates the utter alienness, the foreignness of Roman sexualities to us. We often look back at Greece and Rome and think we recognize these people and we can understand who they are and where they're coming from. But this is a paradigm in which you say to a man that it's perfectly okay for you to kiss your boyfriend It's perfectly okay for you to engage in sexual intercourse with them, taking the active role always. But the minute you give that guy a hand job afterwards, dude, that's disgusting. That is perverted. We are not okay with that. Which I find wonderful and absurd, and this culture continues to surprise and fascinate me in strange and unexpected ways. So that is the end of my exploration of Roman sexualities, and speaking of absurd and fascinating things,
all right, well, speaking of our speakers, I learned a lot. Perhaps we could have our speakers drag some chairs up here and we could take some questions from the audience. Lurk. I think I'm going to leave that up here.
why not? I don't get many opportunities to do this in public, so.
Okay. All right, well, okay. How's that? Okay, I can see questions popping up already. Adam.
Hi. So if going back to the genetic advantage with like sexual reproduction, if that advantage is so strong, then why aren't there like 60 sexes or 70 or 4 or 9 or some number?
No, 2.
Well, so what distinguishes between the two sexes is this, okay. This act of sex itself is the combination of 2 different gametes. So you're having one gamete, so like for example the X chromosome, or one X and one Y come together, and so you're combining the 2 gametes. So that's where you're getting the recombination happening. For diploid organisms only have 2 sets. Polyploids, you can, I don't know much about polyploids.
It sounds like there's not an obvious answer.
Yeah. But and also, why, like, there are only 2 gender, or like a male and a female rather than male, female. There's also, I mean, there do exist organisms that have both male and female reproductive systems.
Like 3 different things.
Yeah, so why don't you have 3? What distinguishes a male and a female is the anisogamy. So anything that produces fewer gametes with a lot of investment in that gamete, we deem a female. And anything that produces many small investment things, we usually deem a male. So I don't think there's ever been a case where you have 3 different sizes of gametes, but that would be an interesting case.
Like they seem to have polarized at 2 ends of the spectrum.
No, but you got like 2 guys could like release their sperm into a pit or something, and those could mix together. And
Yeah. So you do have non-male, non-female sexual interaction where both gametes are the same size, and we call that plus minus. But I don't know that there would be an advantage to having a gamete that could mate with a smaller gamete, but it's not as big as the biggest gamete, because the smaller gametes would obviously go for the biggest gametes because they've got more nutrition, or they've got more resources for the offspring, and their offspring are going to do better.
Alright, interesting question. More food for thought. Any questions? Oh, man, it's like a grade 8 sex ed class. Cats, I thought the hands would be flying up. Go one at the back, Milan.
On that last one, doesn't it seem plausible that it's just a logistical problem? The benefit you get in terms of reproductive strategy of having to combine, say, 4 genomes instead of 2 is like a higher rate of mixing.
Mm-hmm.
But the big disadvantage is you have to have 4 organisms come together either all at once or in some sequence to actually achieve this. So is the benefit of more mixing worth all the extra inconvenience? And you can think about the inconvenience in terms of the behavior of whole organisms, or in terms of the molecular biology of it. where you'd have to have all this additional machinery for combining genomes into these like half genomes, and then combining those in some additional step. It's hard to imagine how all of that would come together as a result of accumulating mutations.
Yeah, I think it would definitely complicate matters a lot
So
more.
it's a jump from 1 to 2, and like and you could have them mixed together and not be fixed at 4. It could be 4 or less. Like 2 of the sperm could mix together with each other, and then however much sperm was in this magic pit would result in more and more diversity.
Just like a gradient sex ed. I have a question for Chloe. Are there any other sort of repetitive motifs that Nabokov uses in this work? It sounds like if he used, as you're suggesting, he was using in a very deliberate way. Did he just stop with the word throb, or were there other things that he was sort of invoking repetitively to get this visceral response?
So I haven't read the book in a while, and I don't work on it in a consistent way at all. At some point I was seeing a trend with actually the word sob, in working with the symmetry and the sounds between those. He plays a lot with words too. So he'll make up words and gosh, I wish I had examples, but yeah.
Okay, potentially. Nathan.
I have a question for you. I forget your name.
Oh, David.
David, if you have come across much Roman literature written by women, and if they had different expressions of what's considered feminine sex or masculine sex.
Well, of course, unfortunately, one of the great failings of the classical discipline is that we have virtually no evidence about women that comes directly from women. Most of the evidence that we have for female sexuality comes from people like Marshall. And people do tend from time to time to overread male perspectives on female sexuality and draw unsupportable conclusions from them. Within the Roman context, almost nothing. We do, of course, have Sappho in the Greek tradition, and she remained a sort of byword for female sexuality through much of antiquity, certainly through the Roman period. But unfortunately, female voices are very few and very far between in our evidence for antiquity.
Oh, that's a question. Mine's for Clay. Really, really good. Aesthetic sort of philosophy, since like Kant, sort of, or aesthetic contemplation or contemplation of the beautiful or whatever, required a sort has viewed a lot of sort of required sort of a disinterested subject. And by that I mean when you're looking at something that's beautiful, as soon as you're looking at it, if you're judging it good or bad, or you're judging it because you have some, if you find it useful or not useful, it ceases to be beautiful or aesthetic. It's in Derrida's famous phrase, it is the pleasure in which we do not take, which is, Derrida. But, so as soon as we lose that disinterest, it ceases to be aesthetic. Which is fine, but the problem that comes out of a lot of this is that you get aesthetic contemplation is reposed, is a passive spectator, someone who's not acting, but you seem to suggest that Nabokov has a much more dynamic view of aesthetics, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that. Which is cool.
What I find really hard with readings of Lolita is that there is a separation between aesthetics and subject.
Mm-hmm.
So many times are there interviews where critics say, oh, it's just such a wonderful love story. It's about love. It's about Lolita seducing Humbert Humbert. It's about her wanting it. It's about her, and saying, and it's also a beautiful book.
Mm-hmm.
That it's the really hard part about it, and it's like you read when he says that there's no morality, and it absolves you from engaging in a moral way. There's not a disinterested subject reader in this case, I don't think, at least. I mean, the triggers are there. It might not be in individual words, but it is. You're reading beautiful prose, and then you're reminded that 3 lines ago there was a girl sobbing in the background. Like, but you're reading about these sublime landscapes, and I think that the whole trick that Nabokov is playing is about engaging what would otherwise be a disengaged reader. He can't have that. It's it doesn't belong to a book with that subject matter. It would be totally inappropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's something
Adrian.
So off of that question and that
Yeah.
response, what I'm seeing from both you and David, first of all, David, so the very first day I met you and the very first time we ate, you gave that poem, and so that was my very first impression.
Indeed.
Yeah. Which leads to pretty good friendships, I think.
I should open with that more often.
For sure, yeah. So to put you two in dialogue, what I'm seeing is a reaction against the Kantian, post-Kantian reader/viewer response theory that like appreciation is disinterest, right? Like what I'm seeing with you two is you both re-embody the practice of cultural analysis, as in the very first thing you two take into account is how do I react to this? How does my body react to this? Not just where I throb or I cringe, but also like what do I feel seeing a different paradigm, or reading my paradigm into a different paradigm of sexuality, for instance, with your first picture, or and this is a comment which I invite you two to speak on. But what I'm seeing is a movement that your embodied analysis gestures towards in criticism. One, it democratizes it. Two, it brings it out of the bourgeoisie disinterested, reader or observer or scholar rather. But 3, it's also a critique on how we think about time, right? Like, if I were to frame Nabokov in the post-war, present-ish contemporary moment, it's a way that you used your embodied reaction to an affect in general to think about the current condition, right? That you use cringing in a very productive way to think about the now, whereas David uses the visceral reaction of alternative sexuality to think about difference, think about pastness, right, and not to essentialize the past. This is the past, like the Romans are the past for past sake, and let's stop appropriating or rather, imparting our own worldviews on, what we see as alternative sexualities and paradigms. So, yeah.
Yeah, certainly from a perspective of, Roman sexuality, ancient sexuality in a reception context has always been interesting because there's a long tradition of people reacting to what they saw Romans doing. I mean, there's so much sex in the literary tradition, it's unreal. And so you can't escape it, even when people were, at times when people were just deeply, deeply uncomfortable with it. And so there's a long history of people reading these texts and reacting to them and trying to modify them in some way, trying to impose on them or draw out of them whatever it was convenient or useful at that time. Even very recently, when the explosion in gender and sexuality studies in classics started to happen, it was from a really positivist perspective where people were looking at this sexual paradigm that was unfamiliar to our own and trying to use it as a foundation for social justice issues in a contemporary context, and saying like here's a society where homosexuality was okay, and kind of draw that out as a basis and incorporate it into the current cultural context. And of course that also manipulated and undermined and somewhat corrupted the culture itself. So my approach has always been to try as much as possible to inhabit the text that I'm working through and internalize in some sense what was actually going on. Precisely because it's so alien and so foreign, you have to do that if you're actually really going to get a handle on what this actually going on in this culture, to remove the tendency either to impose ideas on it or to pull useful ideas out of it and try to incorporate them today. It's an interesting phenomenon, certainly, and it's taken a lot of, strange and sometimes useful and sometimes really unuseful forms.
To add, I guess my I started my presentation with a sort of a synopsis of the novel. I realized this week that some people would ask me what I was going to talk about, and then I said Lolita, thinking like, what I'm going to talk about, right? Not everybody knew what was going on. What people do know in popular culture is that Lolita is a sexually precocious young girl. If you look at the history of the way that that's represented, you could Google and find countless blogs that show you all of the movie covers or book covers of Lolita, remakes of movies where she is totally weirdly 5 or 6 years older than she was in the book. Culturally, we think of it in terms of the responsibility of that little girl. I needed to talk about it from what's actually going on in the most frank way, and that hasn't translated into our culture. We talk about Lolitas, we don't talk about Humbert Humberts. That was from an article that I read online, which I thought was quite powerful. What I was trying to do is engage with that past interpretation. It is and was the most dominant one. There's a YouTube video of Lionel Trilling with who's a American critic with Garrett Burton on CBC with Nabokov in the 1960s, I guess. And Lionel Trilling says, "Oh, it's just such a great story to tell. Such a great story representative of our time and our struggles at home in the bedroom, basically." It's about breaking it out of that kind of a reading, because we never hear Lolita's voice in the novel. She is called Lolita by Humbert. Her name is Dolores, and she never talks. So that's what I was trying to do in terms of engaging with the past and with what is actually in the book. You can't read it without feeling, well, you can't finish it without, as Trevor mentioned this week, he was not able to finish the book. I think maybe it wasn't for that reason, but without feeling engaged in a way, you can't read it in the Kantian sense of the disengaged reader looking at a sublime thing in nature. There's other moments of sublime in that book, but those aren't them. So yeah.
Does that answer your question?
That was great. Yeah.
I have a question for Rosemary, and it's, of course, just gone out of my head. Right. So you were talking about one of your colleagues was removing a gene that allowed these flying insects to have hook-shaped antennae, which is this CRISPR-Cas9, or what is he using to do this?
So he's
I have a
actually,
follow-up question, but
it's not actually removing the gene, I don't know the specifics of it because I'm not a geneticist.
Okay.
But they actually manipulate, so it downplays the expression. So there are actually different levels of expression of the gene, and the gene controls various levels of specialization of the antenna into hook hooks or grasping. Some of them are like little, it's not a hook, but the little nubs that provide more friction, so that they can kind of stick on to the female. And
So my follow-up question is sort of more of a hypothetical, but if there are particular sort of genetic areas that you could sort of poke or prod for the insects you're interested in, what sort of characteristics would you mess around with to see what would happen?
well, so I mean, first off, disclaimer: I don't actually study the sexual aspects of dragonflies in general,
Not necessarily dragonflies, I mean,
or
not
damselflies. I look at more dispersal and habitat selection. So, I mean, an obvious thing to look at in dragonflies for dispersal would be something like wing length. Would be cool to manipulate. But I also look at habitat selection, particularly eggs that overwinter in Canada, so they have to deal with cold conditions. So it'd be cool to manipulate, I don't know, the thickness of the egg covering the chorion. Or I don't know if it's chorion, probably not. Oh no, it is chorion in the dragonflies and damselflies. But I don't know if that.
No, sure, no, this is a good answer. Any questions?
Just a question for all of you. On the one hand, sex from the sort of biological point of view, it's almost very descriptive and very clear. Sort of, you have the benefit of having more than just one sex and have the benefit of that sexual intercourse to all of that. On the other hand, the sex plays such a special role in the modern life of the human. We could look at it through a moralizing point of view. We could look at the culture and throughout history, different culture, we seem to have that obsession with sex, which is. But when it comes down to it, though, you can say, oh, it's just try to keeping up the generation, right? But so why are we bother with sex so much? What is your opinion? Why are we just so obsessed with it? And why does it have such a important pull on us and on our institution, on our life, and on everything that we know?
Strongly selective one. All right, so I got 3 perspectives to go.
In my case, I think that the choice of sex as a theme in this novel is very strategic in that, as I said, there is no moral debate to the idea of pedophilia. It is an untouchable moral standard. I think that was really important, to put something incredibly taboo and then play with it and see what you could extract from an audience, basically. So I guess that was my contribution tonight. There are no lessons on sexuality to learn from Lolita.
You knew it all when you picked up the book.
Of course, fascination with sex seems to take wildly different forms throughout time across cultures. I mean, the obsession with it is a constant, but it finds expression in so many different forms. I mean, I'm drifting away from the consensus among many classicists that a lot of ancient sexuality is, specifically Roman sexuality, or sort of the cultural conception of it, had to do with this expressions of power, expressions of dominance. I think people have gone a little bit too far in that direction, but certainly it was, that is a factor, that sex becomes a vector for other things that are prominent factors that are cultural and social obsessions in a society. As for why yeah, I mean, I think that sex is actually backgrounded and other things are foregrounded, or the other way around possibly, across cultures, across time, where it becomes symbolic of many different things. It becomes representative of things that we care about in society. Victorian sexual repression, 60s sexual liberation, etc. It becomes a byword. It becomes a metaphor for what we care about as a society, which is sort of interesting. As for why it occupies that position of importance in so many societies. I'd be inclined to think, drifting into science and biology territory, is that the drive is so strong across species, across mammals certainly, that if other animals suddenly developed human levels of intelligence, they would probably obsess about sex on exactly the same level that we do.
Elephants probably.
Yeah.
It was baked in around the same time as we got a vertebrate.
Yeah. We're just human beings are saddled with the ability to reason abstractly about it, and several thousand years of trying to deal psychologically with these urges has produced all these weird obsessions that we have. Would be my basic response, I guess.
And if I'm gonna, you dipped into the realm of biology, and I'm gonna go the other way. And so we've evolved these kind of positive feedback mechanisms, like sex makes us feel good. We get flooded with oxytocin. And so we have this very physical response, but humans being the silly creatures that they are, they have consciousness, they're aware of these, so they're aware of these emotions and strong feelings that get associated when they have sex. But of course these reactions then become co-opted they get these responses from other things, not in the actual act of reproduction, but by masturbation, or you can get the response from, I don't know, looking at very nice shoes or eating chocolate. So this response that is evolved to encourage us to reproduce then gets associated with other things, and then we don't understand why we're feeling like we are, but we definitely know that we're feeling something, and so we make up stories around this, and then of course sex becomes more than just reproduction. It becomes dominance, it becomes feelings of power and gratification.